Hi, I'm Chris Green, the History Chap, telling the forgotten stories from British history. In the dry, unforgiving landscape of British Somaliland in August 1913, a young British officer rode out at the head of a camel-mounted force. His name was Richard Corfield. What followed would become one of the most disastrous episodes in the British Empire's 20-year campaign against a man that they called the Mad Mullah. British Somaliland was a narrow strip of land on the northern coast of the Horn of Africa, bordering the Gulf of Aden. Today it's part of modern-day Somalia. Since the 1830s, when they'd seized Aden on the Arabian Peninsula, the British had controlled the narrow waterway from the Indian Ocean into the Red Sea and the Suez Canal beyond. However, the French establishing their colony of French Somaliland in 1884 and the Italians establishing a presence in the Horn of Africa with both their colonies of Italian Somaliland and Eritrea the following year, that dominance of the vital shipping lane was under threat. And thus, as much to deny the coastline of northern Somalia to her rivals as for any imperial grand designs, the British established their own presence in the region. In 1888, the Protectorate of British Somaliland was established. At 68,000 square miles, or 176,000 square kilometres, it was half the size of England, but with a population of just 155,000. It was one of those additions to the British Empire which provided the imperial power with no mineral or agricultural riches. Its sole purpose was to prevent others controlling the African side of the Gulf of Aden, principally centred around the port of Berbera. And yet, to control that coastal strip, they needed to create a buffer zone inland too. However, in that vast, arid hinterland, their influence was shallow. Beyond their strategic control on the coast, British Somaliland was, to all intents and purposes, left to its own devices, run by a variety of feudal tribes and clans. And as long as their rivalries didn't destabilise the British control of the coast, all was well. However, one man refused to accept this status quo, or the presence of the British. Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, a poet, scholar and devout Sufi Muslim, had returned from studying in Mecca with a zealous desire to purify Somali Islam. Drawing inspiration from the Mahdi in Sudan, he rejected colonial interference in the Horn of Africa. Gathering his supporters at the town of Bureo in the spring of 1899, he sent the British a letter which essentially declared war on the colonial regime. His struggle with the British would last over 20 years. Hassan's movement, known as the Dervishes, gathered thousands of followers. Whilst the colonial powers might have drawn up boundaries on maps, out there in the arid scrubland, those borders meant nothing. And so Hassan's Dervish army would spend the next 2 decades crisscrossing the borders between British and Italian Somalilands and the independent but Christian Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia too. And whilst his Dervish forces ended up fighting both the Italians and the Abyssinians, it was the British who would be their main enemy. Nowadays, the Dervishes are often seen as a nationalist independence movement fighting colonialism. At the time, however, a large part of its energy was spent tackling other nomadic groups who didn't share Mullah Hassan's view of Islamic purification. And all this intertribal fighting, as much as the clashes with the imperial authority, upset that careful balance that the British had established with the inland tribes and clans. And that in turn threatened her hold on the coastline. For the next 20 years, the British launched multiple expeditions to suppress Hassan's uprising, and the British press would dub him the Mad Mullah. The first campaign began in 1900, led by Lieutenant Colonel Eric Swain. This expedition achieved little. After an initial confrontation, Hassan simply melted away with his men into the vast hinterland. The British simply didn't have the resources to chase after him. The second campaign followed in 1901, again under Swain, and pushed further into the interior. But once more, the limited British resources, added to the hostile terrain and simply the size of it, meant that Hassan was able to remain one step ahead of his pursuers. For the British, it was like chasing a ghost. For Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, his continued evasion of Swain increased his standing amongst the Somali clans. He also had the men, many armed with rifles, and knew the terrain, to conduct hard-hitting guerrilla ambushes whenever the British did venture into the interior. In 1902, a detachment from the King's African Rifles were advancing through thick scrub when they were ambushed by the Dervishes. Pinned down, they were suddenly charged by the Somalis, who, whilst beaten off, did carry away a Maxim gun. It would remain in their possession until 1920, when it was recaptured. It's now on display at the former KAR barracks in Malawi. The next year, his men ambushed another company of the King's African Rifles. The company, including their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Plunkett, were wiped out. A few days later, another British column also found themselves in trouble, near Daratole. When we say British, what we're actually referring to, principally, were local Somali troops led by British officers. Surrounded by a numerically larger Dervish force, 3 Victoria Crosses were awarded during what became a desperate fighting retreat. One of the VCs was to Captain John Gough on secondment from the Rifle Brigade. The 31-year-old rescued a wounded comrade under heavy fire and rallied his men to finally drive off the Dervish attack. Gough came from a remarkable military family. His father, General Sir Charles Gough, and his uncle, Hugh Gough, both received the Victoria Cross during the Indian Mutiny. This made the Goughs the only family to have 3 Victoria Cross recipients. I've told their story in a separate episode, so check it out later. John Gough would go on to have a distinguished military career, eventually attaining the rank of Brigadier General during the First World War, where he was killed in action in 1915 at Neuve-Chapelle in France. What the British really needed to defeat the Mad Mullah was a full-scale battle, rather like they'd had at Omdurman in Sudan just a few years beforehand. Finally, in 1904, they got just that battle. On the 10th of January 1904, near the settlement of Jidballi, Major General Charles Egerton, leading a force of nearly 5,000 men, goaded the Dervish army into a battle. Not only did Egerton command a sizable force, but it also comprised of units from the British Indian Army, such as the 27th Punjabis and the 51st Sikhs. As usual, his force also included 3 battalions of African troops from the King's African Rifles. And also present were 100 regular British soldiers from the Hampshire Regiment. Facing them were an estimated 6,000 to 8,000 Dervish warriors. The Dervishes launched several bold frontal attacks, but were met with Maxim guns and coordinated rifle volleys. The result was devastating. Over 1,000 Dervishes were killed and the rest routed. The Battle of Jidballi had lasted just 20 minutes. British losses were light, just 3 officers and 31 others killed. Egerton reported that apart from the physical losses inflicted on the Dervish army, he'd also captured 500 rifles, 24,000 camels and 36,000 head of other livestock. Whichever way you looked at it, it was a decisive victory for the British over an army that relied on guerrilla tactics and living off the land. Well, there was one tiny caveat. Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, the Mad Mullah, had managed to escape. Nevertheless, the British government saw it as a major victory and happily wound down the military operation, which had cost over £2 million in those days' money, and handed Somaliland back to the civil authorities. It looked like they'd made the right choice when within months the Mad Mullah himself had approached the Italians to broker a peace. At the ensuing treaty, signed in March 1905, Hassan agreed to settle down peacefully in the Italian Somaliland. But if the British thought that the war was over, they were very much mistaken. Hassan was merely resting and regrouping. And while he did so, Britain shifted to a policy of containment, withdrawing troops and relying on local levies to police the interior. By 1908, Mohammed Hassan had re-emerged, stronger than ever. Britain's war with the Mad Mullah was back on. His forces raided rival clans and attacked British positions. Somaliland outside the writ of the British descended into a series of bloody intertribal feuds, compounded by Hassan's jihad against those who wouldn't follow his path. Some estimates suggest that anything up to a third of the nomadic male population of the hinterland died in this Somali-on-Somali bloodletting. By 1913, Hassan controlled a significant swathe of the interior, with a fortified base at Taleh, a multi-walled fortress complex with towers, a mosque and stores. Located approximately 220 miles or 370 kilometres inland from the colonial capital at Berbera, Taleh served as the Dervish capital. From this remote, inaccessible stronghold, Hassan could launch raids, project authority and consolidate his rule. It would need a huge military operation to cross that terrain and trap Hassan in his fortress, and quite frankly, the British didn't have the resources or the desire to take up that challenge. So they were left with a troublesome rebel whom they couldn't defeat, but who couldn't defeat them either. To make the best of the situation and to contain the raiding dervishes in the interior, the British formed the Somaliland Camel Constabulary, a mounted paramilitary-style police force. Using a combination of local Somalis as troopers and British officers who had experience of frontier warfare from elsewhere in the empire, they relied upon speed of mobility and local knowledge to counter Hassan's dervish warriors. And it was with this force that a young 30-year-old officer, Richard Corfield, would ride to both glory and disaster in 1913. Richard Conyngham Corfield was born on the 27th of April 1882 in Heanor, Derbyshire. He was the eldest of 3 children to Reverend Conyngham William George Corfield and Henrietta Edwards. When his father died in 1888, Richard, then just 6, was raised by his mother. Educated at Marlborough College, Corfield was known for a sharp mind and adventurous spirit. After a brief stint with a Liverpool shipping company, he joined Robert Baden-Powell's South African Constabulary during the Boer War. Though still a teenager, he quickly distinguished himself in the frontier conditions. A recommendation for a commission, however, was denied due to his age. After a brief spell back in England, he successfully applied to become a political officer in British Somaliland. He was one of just 6 European administrators tasked with covering the, by now, lawless interior of the Protectorate. Corfield was just 23. In 1910, he moved on to a similar role in Nigeria before, in 1912, returning to the Horn of Africa for a very special role. The previous year, the British had appointed a new Commissioner and Commander-in-Chief to British Somaliland. Born in Tottenham, Middlesex in 1875, Horace Byatt had served in the Protectorate for 6 years and was seen as a man who knew the lie of the land and its complex clan structures. It was Byatt who, with that local knowledge, had established the Somaliland Camel Constabulary. And now, in December 1912, Byatt selected Richard Corfield to lead this force, recognising in him a rare mix of initiative, charisma and frontier experience. In return, Corfield, who was promoted to the rank of Commandant, saw the appointment as both a challenge and a duty. Described by peers as principled, brave and deeply committed to imperial ideals, Corfield also possessed a streak of recklessness. He was not one to sit back whilst others took the field. It would prove his undoing. In early August 1913, Dervish raiders launched an aggressive attack on the Dul Madoba, a Somali clan allied to the British. Reports of the violence reached Corfield, who decided to retaliate, despite receiving instructions to avoid large-scale engagements without reinforcements. He mobilised a force of 110 men from the Camel Constabulary, most of them Somali troopers with a handful of British officers, and also about 300 Dul Madoba tribesmen. The force set out from their base at Barao on a punishing ride through the harsh terrain in pursuit of the Dervish raiders. Corfield's second in command was Captain Gerald Henry Summers. An officer in the British Indian Army, he had been seconded to the King's African Rifles, and from there received a further secondment to the Camel Constabulary. Now, this layered career path was not uncommon in Britain's far-flung colonies, where experienced officers were shuffled around posts to meet local needs. Together, Corfield, Summers and their men travelled for 40 miles, 65 kilometres, northeast across the dry, rocky plateau of the Togdere region. It was typical of the Somali interior, stony, dust-blown and studded with thorn bushes and acacia trees. The open landscape offered little cover from the enemy, or from the sun. August marked the height of the dry season, with daytime temperatures regularly exceeding 35 degrees Celsius and water sources reduced to scattered wells and dry riverbeds. Heat exhaustion and dehydration were constant threats. On the 9th of August, near Dul Madoba, about 70 miles 100 kilometres north of the Dervish capital at Taleh, the column was ambushed by a force of 2,750 well-armed Dervish warriors under one of Hassan's principal lieutenants, Ibrahim Zurani. The battle was swift and brutal. At 06:45, Corfield ordered his men into a skirmish line and tried to advance through the dense scrub. Seeing their difficulty and the extended line, the Dervish charged. The Somali tribesmen who were on the left of the British line immediately fled, turning the British flank, and things rapidly went from bad to worse. Captain Summers was hit 3 times in a minute by accurate Somali rifle fire, and then the constabulary's Maxim machine gun jammed after firing just 3 belts. Corfield was last seen rallying his men under withering fire, his revolver in hand. He was eventually shot and killed, struck in the head whilst trying to reposition his troops. It was 07:45 a.m. With Corfield dead and Summers critically wounded, command of what was left of the British force passed to a civilian accompanying the column. Cecil de Sivrak Dunn was an experienced colonial administrator in his mid-30s. Fluent in Somali and respected by local elders, he had been invaluable in liaising with tribal leaders and navigating the shifting loyalties of the Protectorate. Dunn now took control of a desperate situation. Displaying calm under pressure, he organised the remaining men into a tight defensive position, using fallen camels to build a barricade. His leadership helped prevent a complete annihilation. Thanks to the discipline of the surviving Somali men of the Camel Constabulary and their improvised barricade, the British force held off multiple Dervish attacks. Unable to break through, low on ammunition, and with their own losses mounting, the Dervishes finally withdrew at around 11 a.m. Behind them, they left 36 constabulary men dead, including their commander, and 21 wounded, over half the British column. It was a stunning victory for Hassan's warriors, but it had come at a high cost. 395 of his men lay dead around the British position. With no news from Corfield, a small relief column, led by Acting Commissioner Geoffrey Francis Archer, set out in search of the Camel Constabulary. They found what was left of Corfield's force early the next morning, and having provided medical aid, they moved on to the now deserted battlefield. Here they buried the dead, including Corfield, where they'd fallen. The loss of Corfield and so many constabulary troopers sent shockwaves through the British colonial establishment. Questions were raised about whether Corfield had disobeyed orders. Others held him up in a long line of martyrs like Charles Gordon and the Shangani Patrol, who had died for Britain's imperial mission. It was also a painful reminder that the mad Mullah was back, and he was undefeated. For the Dervishes, it was a victory that revitalised Hassan's standing among Somalis. The ambush proved that even a modern, well-armed imperial force could be defeated. The Dervish victory at Dul Madoba was later immortalised in Somali oral tradition through the poem Anago Talaksnal. Narrated from the perspective of a warhorse, the poem celebrates the resistance and the symbolic triumph over the British forces. The Mad Mullah himself also wrote a poem celebrating the demise of Richard Corfield. It begins, "You have died, Corfield, and are no longer in this world. A merciless journey was your portion." But for all his crowing, Hassan knew the limitations of his victory. The British still controlled the coast, and he was no closer to clearing them out of Somaliland. Moreover, his heavy losses also revealed the high cost of a war with an industrial power who, due to the strategic importance of the Suez Canal, were determined to stay. With neither side willing to compromise, it was only a matter of time before a final reckoning. During the First World War, he declared allegiance to the Ottoman Caliph, but despite an initial panic in London, his call for a jihad against the British failed to materialise. Nevertheless, his low-level insurrection continued to result in sporadic, small-scale battles with the reformed Camel Constabulary. At one of these, at the mountain fortress of Shimbaberes in 1914, British officer Sir Adrian Carton de Wiart lost his eye after being shot in the face. Awarded the Distinguished Service Order DSO for that action, I've actually told his full life story in a separate episode. Wounded 11 times, including that eye, he also lost a hand, and despite that, dug himself out of a POW camp at the age of 63, an absolutely incredible man. Serving alongside de Wiart in the Camel Constabulary at that battle was another officer on secondment. Hastings Pug Ismay would go on to be Churchill's chief military assistant in World War II and the first Secretary-General of NATO. When the First World War finally ended, the British could turn their attention to Somaliland once more. The fifth and final British expedition against their nemesis, Mohammed Abdullah Hassan, the Mad Mullah, took place in 1920. This time, they would bring the weapons of the First World War with them. In that final campaign, the British launched a coordinated ground and air offensive, marking one of the earliest uses of air power in colonial warfare. This innovative approach was championed by the then Secretary of State for War and Air, Winston Churchill, who saw air power as a cost-effective way to manage imperial frontiers. 12 RAF aircraft bombed the Dervish stronghold of Taleh, causing widespread destruction and demoralising Hassan's forces. At the same time, ground forces comprising of a battalion from the King's African Rifles, drawn from Nyasaland, modern-day Malawi, and Corfield's old Somaliland Camel Constabulary advanced overland. The combined pressure proved too much, and in just 3 weeks Taleh fell in early 1920. Once more, Hassan was able to escape, but this time there was no way back. Fleeing into the Ogaden region, Mohammed Abdullah Hassan died from influenza later that year. The British had finally defeated the Mad Mullah. His passing marked the end of the Dervish insurrection and restored British control over the interior of Somaliland. His legacy remained deeply divisive. Hero freedom fighter to some, fundamentalist tyrant to others. But whatever his legacy, he is still remembered in modern-day Somalia. The same can't be said for the British characters in our story. Back in 1913, Richard Corfield's death was deeply mourned in Britain. He was eulogised in Parliament and in the press. Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem in his honour, Corfield's Grave, which cast him as a Christ-like figure, sacrificing himself for those he barely knew, very much in the model of the white man's burden. The poem reinforced the ideal of the colonial officer, principled, courageous, and bound by duty. Back in his hometown of Hena in Derbyshire, a memorial tablet was erected in the Church of St. Lawrence. You can still see it there today. Captain Somers survived his injuries and returned to duty. In 1922, he was appointed Commissioner of British Somaliland. He died in office in 1925. Cecil de Siverick Dunn would go on to serve as a Major General in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers during the First World War. In 1921, he was part of the Inter-Allied Commission, which oversaw the Silesia plebiscite, which established the border between Germany and the newly independent Poland. Born in Great Malvern, Worcestershire, Dunn died in Hampshire in 1945, aged 67. Commissioner Horace Bryant would go on to become the first British governor of Tanganyika, the former German East Africa, after the First World War. He died in London in 1933. British Somaliland remained a protectorate for another 40 years. Occupied by the Italians at the start of the Second World War before being liberated, it then briefly gained independence in 1960, before merging with the former Italian Somaliland to form the Republic of Somalia. In 1991, following the collapse of the Somali central government, the region reasserted itself as the independent Republic of Somaliland. Though still unrecognised internationally, it maintains a separate administration and has avoided much of the chaos and violence affecting the rest of Somalia. The story of Richard Corfield and the Battle of Dul Madoba is not one many people know today. It's a tale buried in the dust of history, overshadowed by greater wars and a prevailing embarrassment to talk about the British Empire. But here was a man who rode out, vastly outnumbered, to do his duty in a hostile land. A man who died leading from the front. And his courage, like that of Gough before him, deserves its place in the long tradition of British military honour. In an age where history is often judged by modern standards and fashion, it's worth reflecting that some stories, however uncomfortable, however forgotten, still carry timeless messages that we would do well to remember today. Messages of duty, loyalty, and sacrifice. And that men like Corfield, who gave everything in distant places, should not be lost to time. Well, thanks for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed that story from a forgotten outpost of the British Empire. How about catching up on my stories about two more soldiers who fought against the Mad Mullah in Somaliland, to Adrian Carton de Wiart and John Gough VC. Links to both stories are in the description below. And if you'd like to support my channel, then please consider becoming a member, a patron, or making a one-off donation. I'm Chris Green, the History Chap. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.